Hi, everybody, especially online people. Thanks for putting up with us. We are here today to hear from the Underwater Science Lab and for talking about shipwrecks in the digital age, which I'm super excited. I've been working with some of these data sets, but like in absentia of all the expert knowledge. And if you're not here today, you're going to miss out on the quest because we're going to actually put people into VR environments at the end to see this. But next week, I don't even think this is on our schedule. What am I talking about next week? Katie, David? Oh, 3D digitization. Nope, that's the week after that. Is next week fall break? Nope, that's in October. Yeah, sorry, I should have brought my schedule. Oh, so we're talking about advanced media, which will include things like the touchscreen wall here and some other cool affordances that we have. So please join us then. So now I will, to Sam.
All right, is this audio okay? Can you hear the mic from here? Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about shipwrecks in the digital age. So we're talking about, underwater cultural resource management and submerged cultural resources and how changing technology is going to allow these incredible, incredible pieces of human history and archaeological material to be shared with anyone. You know, it's not just, we're no longer in a time where you have to be a scuba diver and be able to go travel to the Dominican Republic and, charter a boat and go out 10 miles offshore to see a shipwreck. Now you can do it, from the comfort of your own home or from a, magic touchscreen wall in the middle of central Indiana. This talk, Digital Scholarship Lab, is sponsored by the UITS Research Technologies Cyberinfrastructure for Digital Humanities and Creative Activities. So I'm sure that if you're tuning into this, you have some familiarity with what that is. But we are very happy to come here and talk. Tassie has been a huge help in us in getting, a lot more processing power behind our research, because ultimately, myself, Tori, who's here joining us, and a number of other underwater science researchers, we are not technology people. We are not information technology driven, and being able to have people to come help us and help do this more advanced computing is extremely helpful for us to be able to do the science and then ultimately bring the science and bring these underwater resources to the public. So a little bit myself, my name is Sam Haskell. I am the Assistant Director for the Center for Underwater Science. We are a very small multidisciplinary research center that's located, across the IU campus, but is currently focused in the School of Public Health. So you might say, why is underwater science in the School of Public Health? Well, it goes back to the 1960s when scuba was first being taught at the university systems, and Indiana University was one of the first. And ultimately it was in, the PE department, right? You have to take a physical education class. Well, why not scuba? And we had a scuba pool that you could go and you could learn to scuba dive. And so originally it was in the HYPER, Health, Physical Education and Recreation School. And then as time went on, the program evolved and started doing all of this active research with anthropology and history and geology and biology, and it just kind of stayed. And so here we are now, in 2019, doing archaeological research out of the School of Public Health. Might seem a little bit funny, but it goes all the way back to 1963 with Art Minheim. But I also serve as the diving safety officer. So my role transitioned a little bit last year from what was originally purely research and teaching of archaeology into more institutional policy across all the campuses. So my background is in archaeology, but my primary role now as a diver is, teaching scientific diving and making sure that people are compliant with the, the university policies and regulations. But for those of you, how many divers do we have in the room? 3. So for those of you that are not divers, typically, we classify the dive industry and scuba diving into 4 different spheres, right? So we have recreational diving, which is, me and Zach want to go out to a dive shop and go get scuba certified or go snorkel and go, go be taken on a tour, or maybe we'll get into it more as a hobby, but it's the hobby divers. It's people doing it in their free time. For the most part, non-professionals, although there are professionals that, teach recreational diving. And then we have scientific diving, which by OSHA standards is defined as diving for the sole purpose of data collection. So, okay, you've taken these diving skills and now we're going to go out and we're going to collect data. And we're going to use that to advance scientific knowledge. Then we have commercial diving, which is your contractors. Someone in New York needs to go repair the Brooklyn Bridge at 75 feet underwater. So they contract out to a commercial diver who's under OSHA subpart Section 1910 subpart T commercial diving regulations, and they go out and they follow all their standards and they do it as a part of their job. It could be everything from the disgusting septic tank divers to working on oil rigs in open ocean. And then we have military diving, which is one facet that is very, very far removed from the other three. Military diving is generally not usually talked about when we're talking about the dive industry. When you go to trade shows and stuff and scientific diving conventions, you'll hear about these other two. For example, commercial diving is often employed a lot by scientists. Scientists may need commercial work done, and so all three of these different fields are very, very intertwined. But what we do at the university is mostly a mixture of recreational and scientific diving. We do the recreational dive training as a backdrop, so that we get these basic certifications and we go, you clear your mask a few times, you do some skills, okay, great, you're done with that, now let's get to work and let's do science and let's collect data. So scientific diving is the focus and the core of what our work here is at the university. It just so happens that most of the faculty members in the Center for Underwater Science are archaeologists, but it is very important to know we are multidisciplinary, and the work that we do is multidisciplinary. So it's not just going and mapping shipwrecks. We do a lot of biological monitoring. We recently have started into working on adaptive scuba diving, which is, so we have various people with disabilities. How do we take them and get them diving? Because ultimately, if you can breathe, you can go scuba diving, right? So if we can get them underwater and get them breathing and blowing bubbles, and then there are people who might not be able to scuba dive for physical or financial limitations. So now it's okay, how do we get these resources and these things and get them to them? And that's where this amazing new digital technology comes in, is okay, we can now bring shipwrecks to anyone, regardless of where they are. So we try and focus, and we try and talk mostly about scuba as a tool, right? As we love scuba diving, it's great, it's wonderful, but it's really just another tool. It's really just another shovel, it's another ruler, it's another way to get the data that we as scientists are trying to collect. So at the university here, what we do during the school year, you might say, how can you have this diving program in the middle of landlocked Indiana and be able to accomplish research overseas? Well, we spend most of the school year, with some trips interspersed in throughout it, working on the fundamentals of scientific diving and training our students in a confined water and an open water environment to be better divers, both recreationally and getting those foundational dive skills, so that then that stuff can all be second nature when it's time to actually go in the field and collect data. And then we work with these students over the course of the school year to get them to the point where we are comfortable and they are comfortable, that we can all say, all right, let's go as a part of a class, let's go to Dominican Republic, let's go to California, let's go to the Florida Keys, and let's do science and put all of these skills to use. So the primary focus of our research, if I were to be able to, we have a broad spectrum of things going on, but living museums in the sea is a resource management strategy that was developed by Indiana University with help from the state of Florida in the 1980s. And it is a strategy it is presented as an alternative to treasure hunting. So we're gonna have to take a step back here before we start talking about what living museums in the sea are, talk about why it came to being as an idea. So with the advent of scuba, everyone goes out, they buy their scuba tank, they learn how to scuba dive, really easy. Well, let's go find some treasure, right? Let's go jump in the water, and who wouldn't want to go down and go to Florida and come up with an authentic pirate coin and be able to say, yes, I have a piece of an 18th century pirate ship and I own it and it's mine. Who wouldn't want to be able to do that, right? And so when we talk about diving, it's almost logical that was one of the immediate things that people jumped onto. And everyone in here looks a little bit too young for it, but if anyone grew up watching Sea Hunt with Lloyd Bridges, the old black and white television serial with Captain Mike Nelson, who would go on adventures and hunt treasure and help find bodies, it's really cool stuff, and who wouldn't want to do it? So as a result, you get a lot of people going and diving for treasure. And I'll pass, this is a archaeologically collected 1725 coin made of pure silver from a Spanish shipwreck called the Nuestra Senora de Begoña that we've worked on. There's a natural intrigue around shipwrecks and around things from the past, especially when you start talking about gold and silver and treasure. But over time, we end up with sad anchors left in yards rotting away. We end up with coins sold and forgotten. A lot of this early salvage diving in the Florida Keys, it was one, just so that everyone knows, perfectly legal. It was completely legal to go out and to go diving and to find a shipwreck. And under, the law of finders, basically it was, if you found it, it was yours and you could work on it and you could recover it and all that stuff was yours. It wasn't until 1988 with the Abandoned Shipwreck Act where, okay, now all of a sudden some of these shipwrecks, we're going to start, legislatively recognizing them as important and saying you can't do that. So when you hear names like, Art McKee and Mel Fisher, these early treasure divers who made fortunes off of these Spanish treasure ships, they are a rarity. Peter Throckmorton, one of the grandfathers of underwater archaeology, said, he wrote an article called "The World's Worst Investment: Treasure Hunting." And it really is, if you think about spending millions and millions of dollars to get together these operations and go out and be able to find ships and recover the treasure, you're not really making that much money selling the treasure. If you think about the cost of, just operational costs for diving for a day, and if you come up with, one silver coin and sell it for $100, well, that's gone. That is, you cannot keep making that money. You cannot keep going. These are finite resources that we're talking about. And then of course you end up with, the things that might be considered of lesser value. Like, I don't know, this is a 12-foot anchor of salvation from a 1733 Spanish galleon that is, the big bad anchor. It tells this amazing story. They were typically found in the hold. They were the massive last ditch parachute for a ship stuck in a storm before, the ship sunk. Of course, they're always found undeployed in the hold because by the time you get into enough trouble to use it, you're not really going to be able to go down and get this massive 12-foot anchor and bring it up. But these are really, really cool, really important pieces of history that if you drive all up and down the Florida Keys, any coastal city in the United States, the Carolinas, you're going to find old anchors leaning up against dive shops, and you're going to find rusty cannons, thrown aside in the yard. And if without proper conservation, these are not going to last. So in 1988, just before the Abandoned Shipwreck Act was passed, just before the Abandoned Shipwreck Act was passed, it's basically said, okay, let's come up with an alternative. So we'll kind of look at this case study of the 1733 New Spain fleet, which was Don Rodrigo del Torres leaving Havana, Cuba on July 13th. He had 15 treasure galleons and 13 other merchant ships of a variety of different nationalities. And they were sailing north from Havana back to Spain. And they got caught in a massive storm and a hurricane. And most of the fleet was scattered along 80 miles of coast. Now, these are, famous Spanish treasure ships. This is probably the most famous of the fleets, this and the 1715 plate fleet, that were then treasure hunted, once people began to recreationally scuba dive and go out and salvage the stuff. And so the state of Florida in the 70s did initial survey of all these shipwreck sites. By 1977, when they were doing the survey, these were completely decimated and stripped for treasure. So the treasure hunters had come in, almost all of the archaeological initial context and integrity was lost because they were destroyed, and all the things of commercial value were brought up. And we were left with the remnants, the ruins of these shipwrecks and what they were. Our director talks about when he was growing up in the early 60s, he said you could go down to Florida and dive and swim through the ribs of these galleons. I mean, the wood was all intact in there and you could see it, but the ribs are in the way of the treasure. So we have to remove all the stuff and blow it apart. And you end up with really sad state of affairs for a lot of these shipwrecks in the Florida Keys. So then in 1988, the Florida Bureau of Archaeological Research got together with Florida State University and Indiana University and said, well, let's look at all these sites and let's turn one into a park. Let's try this. Let's go out on a limb and let's take one of these shipwreck sites that's already been treasure hunted and stripped, and let's make it a state park. Let's make it a public place for people to come and learn about the past and give back to the community. And so then in 1989, the San Pedro Underwater Archaeological Preserve was opened. And it was You could just set that right there. And it was pitched as a living museum in the sea. This is an underwater archaeological preserve that protects both the archaeology, both what's left of the shipwreck, and the biology, because that's one thing that, for a long time in archaeology, we refer to corals as bioclutter. Yeah, just get that bioclutter out of the way. Well, no, it's really important. From an environmental perspective, these are really, really fragile ecosystems, and shipwrecks provide an amazing substrate for coral growth and biological life. So when you're looking at a shipwreck, it's usually covered in fish. It's, we call them fish attracting devices, because that's where the fish go. You want to find a shipwreck, you go talk to the fishermen, because that's where all the fish are. So these are some pictures of the San Pedro. It's really just a pile of rocks. If you were swimming, you might not think anything of it now. It's been removed. All of the valuables have been removed. It's just a ballast pile. Ballast being the, stones that were in the hull of the ship to help keep it upright. So when the state of Florida and IU got together, they decided, well, let's put some cannons back on it. Let's take some museum quality replica cannons, put them back on the site. Let's create some waterproof interpretive guides to give to snorkelers and divers who are going and visiting this site. Let's create a land display. We'll put an authentic 18th century anchor down. This is an anchor, it used to be you had to split all of your findings with the government. So you bring up 10 things, you have to give half of them to the state of Florida. So now the state has this huge backlog of unprovenienced artifacts just sitting in Tallahassee at their labs in various stages of conservation. Well, when it goes in the water, calcium carbonate, it will precipitate, live rock will grow around it, corals will grow, and it will be relatively stable. It's when we take these cannons and these anchors out of the water that they begin to deteriorate. So let's throw one back in the water, let it concrete over again. It's not going to deteriorate in the water like it will on land. So put an anchor underwater, put an interpretive plaque down that talks about the shipwreck for people to come and look at, that gives a little bit of a history. These replica cement cannons were made here at IU and then shipped down to Florida and placed all around the site, as well as on a land display by the side of the highway so that visitors driving down could come and read about it and read about the shipwreck and have something for the non-divers who are visiting the Keys for fishing or to go down to Key West or whatever it is. So now we're left with this wonderful park that I personally think is a success, having been there every year for the last several years. It's a very, very typical inshore patch reef community. There's lots of seagrass, there is a halo of invertebrate grazing that happens around it. You have thousands and thousands of fish, thousands of lobsters. I've never seen more lobster anywhere in the world as there are on the San Pedro in this tiny little ballast pile. Every nook and cranny has lobster in it. Thankfully, it's a protected site, so in mini lobster season, the 2 days in July in Florida, you don't have people coming in and picking it clean of lobster. It's a very, very cool little park. And when we're working on this site, we see at least 10 boats a day stopping and snorkeling at it. It's only 1,000 feet from Lignum Vitae Key and Marathon. If any of you have been to the Keys, have been to Robbie's Bait Shop, you can see Robbie's Bait Shop from the San Pedro. It's a very popular little tourist area. The Boy Scouts of America Sea Base is just less than a mile from the site. So you have all of these Boy Scouts coming every single day and diving it and learning about the importance of protecting our cultural heritage. So this is a really, really dynamic, cool park. But after the mid-90s, we have the establishment of the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary and the state of Florida, John Pennekamp Coral Reef State Park. We have a big presence of archaeologists. This is pretty well under control. These sites aren't being treasure hunted after the Abandoned Shipwreck Act. It's no longer legal. You can't go treasure hunt on these sites or dig on them. They're mostly protected areas. So I don't want to say our work in Florida was done. But as far as the establishment of parks and preserves with the Shipwreck Trail and the National Marine Sanctuary, they pretty well are managing these parks and preserves. So Indiana University now, our role, we still run annual trips to Florida to talk about the history of underwater resource management and underwater resource protection. But as a whole, we're not really doing any active park creation because that's all taken care of by the state and the federal government. So while we are there, we are doing research, we are still doing biological monitoring and archaeological monitoring of the resources over time. We went to Dominican Republic in the mid-90s because if the Florida Keys is the organized, under control, nice. We have great management. The Dominican Republic's the Wild West. Treasure hunting is still perfectly legal there. It is, you have active treasure hunters working all around the country. So Indiana University partnered with the Dominican Office of Underwater Cultural Patrimony and said, well, why don't we provide you with an alternative to treasure hunting? We say, you can bring up a cannon, you can sell it once for like $2,000, or you can leave it in the water, turn it into a park, and sell it every single day to thousands of visitors who come and look at it for as long as it's underwater, and as long as people are willing to come see it. So the first park that we established was the Guadalupe Underwater Archaeological Preserve. Now, the Dominican Republic, if the Florida Keys has a lot of artifacts that have been recovered by treasure hunters, the Dominican Republic has more. They have so many artifacts just sitting in vats at their lab that their two conservatives who work there just don't have enough resources to do it. So we said, why don't we just put them back in the water? Why don't we create a mock shipwreck out of these cannons and anchors and these pieces of the 1724 Guadalupe shipwreck and make it a dive site? If you ever need to study them, you can always bring them up. They're still owned by the government. It's still a government-owned park. So we created the Guadalupe Underwater Archaeological Preserve with the help of a variety of different organizations, from Project Aware to the Peace Corps. USAID gave funding. The Dominican government was heavily involved, both the Ministry of Tourism, the Hotel Association, and the Ministry of Culture created underwater guides. It was a great success. We still dive this site. We still monitor it. We're still using it for dive training. We installed mooring buoys. We put a historic marker buoy on it. There's very little training for boat captains in the country. So one of the things that we had to do is, talk to the local dive shops and show them how to properly moor up. And ultimately, it was very successful. There are land displays. It's now probably the most dived upon site in the country. I can't say that for sure, but I can't think of any other site that sees as many divers in the Dominican Republic as the Guadalupe Underwater Archaeological Preserve. If this is our land display at one of the resorts, the park is right there. You can kind of see the buoys out there. So you can snorkel out to it from the resort. Then the next one was Captain William Kidd. So this is another 2-hour talk. So I'm not going to give the entire history of Captain Kidd and the Quedagh Merchant. But this is one of the things that you'll be able to see in the VR headsets after this talk that we've made 3-dimensional models of, is Captain Kidd's 1699 Quedagh Merchant, the adventure prize captured in the Indian Ocean and sailed back to the New World before William Kidd was ultimately hanged for piracy. This is a very cool shipwreck. It's a little bit more remote, but you get people going out on big catamarans to Catalina Island all the time. This is incredibly shallow. You can stand on top of his pile of cannons. We obviously don't recommend it, but that's how shallow it is. The max depth of the site is about 8 feet. So people can come, jump in with very little training and be able to see this authentic piece of history. The history is wonderful. As an archaeologist, I really appreciate it. Apparently, there's also some pretty nice coral growth there. To us archaeologists, it's bioclutter, but this is critically endangered Acropora palmata elkhorn coral, which is basically, there was a mass die-off of these palmatas, of these elkhorn corals in the 1980s. They have not recovered. There are very, very few of them throughout the Caribbean. For whatever reason, this little stretch of shoreline along Catalina Island at the mouth of the La Romana River, where there's trash flowing by, and when it rains, it's muddy and there's no visibility. For whatever reason, these are thriving. So this has been a biological monitoring site where we've been doing a whole bunch of different analysis on trying to figure out, why are these palmatas thriving in this area? What combination of nutrients, water composition is making these corals thrive? Dr. Claudia Johnson, our associate director, has been heavily involved in this research and is one of our ongoing questions. Captain Kidd, the archaeological research for the most part is done, but it's still a substrate for biological growth, and we're still talking about the cultural resources and their associated biological resources, which is this living museums in the sea. It's the fact that these cultural resources, these cannons, these anchors, these ballast stones, all are now part of the environment and have associated biota that we have to take into account as both archaeologists and as resource managers. So right now, there are 4 living museums in the sea in the Dominican Republic, the newest being in Punta Cana. So Punta Cana is, the big resort town on the east end of the island. Recently the subject of news articles about tourist deaths. It is it's owned by Americans. It is a very, very touristy place. We were working with the Ecological Foundation down there to establish another living museum because they ultimately, with all of their clout, are going to create a national marine sanctuary, an Eastern National Marine Sanctuary on the island, where they're working with the fishermen and working with the local communities to protect the underwater resources of the region. These 3, the Captain Kidd Underwater Archaeological Preserve, the Guadalupe Underwater Archaeological Preserve, and the Morales Underwater Archaeological Preserve, are the original 3 living museums in the sea that were first inaugurated in 2011. They're all in the Bayibe region, La Romana Bayibe region. We are currently in the process of creating 3 more living museums. So in the northwest, we have at Monte Cristi, which is right on the Haitian border. Just outside the capital, on one of the most popular beaches in the entire country, is the 1725 shipwreck, the Nuestra Senora de Begoña, where that coin is from, which is, this tiny little stretch of beach that has coins and platters and plates and treasure chests and everything you could possibly imagine coming off of a ship in 8 feet of water under the most popular beach, under swimmers every single day. And so that is ultimately one that in deeper water, where there are 2 more modern shipwrecks, we are going to create a new park there. The Nuestra Senora de Begoña Underwater Archaeological Preserve. And then the last one is the Enriquillo, which you'll see, again, this is another one that we have in the headset for you guys to check out after this. The Enriquillo is in about 65 feet of water. It is a tugboat that was owned by the Dominican Navy that we didn't really think twice about. It was sunk artificially in like 2003. Not a particularly interesting ship, just a tugboat, until we started, picking at the history of it and find out that the Enriquillo actually was formerly the USS Dallian. The USS Dallian was a US naval vessel that was actually in service at the Battle of Okinawa in the Second World War, and ultimately saw service with the US Navy before it was donated to the Dominican government in the 70s, who used it up until 2000 when they decommissioned it and sunk it as a ship. So this is a really important American ship to American history, which if it were in US waters would meet criteria to be on the National Register of Historic Places. So we've been working with the Navy, with the United States Navy Archives, Bob Nalen, to see if we can get data information on this ship so that we can ultimately turn it into a park and make it a memorial. And make it something that visitors can come and see that's important to both American and Dominican history. And we have a variety of other work going on in the Dominican Republic that I won't get into now. But we're working on a 16th century shipwreck on the east end of the island. And all of these, the reason I'm bringing them up is because all of these are things that we've digitized. We have done photogrammetry, which I'll talk about in a second, of these. And these are things that you can see online and that are accessible to the public. Another facet of our work in Dominican Republic, when we're talking about these contact area shipwrecks, and we're talking about colonialism, and we're talking about the Spanish, we cannot ignore the other side of the equation, which are the people that were already here, the people that greeted Columbus, the people that were here in the 15th and 16th century, which in the Dominican Republic was the people known as the Taino. So as underwater archaeologists, we're not just looking at shipwrecks, we're looking at pretty much anything related to the water and mankind's relationship to the water. So we have these flooded sinkholes in Dominican Republic that were either offering sites from the Taino, where they would offer artifacts, offer things to the gods and to the underworld, or in the case of this one, Padre Nuestro, was a water gathering site, likely a water gathering site that was a dry cave that flooded several thousand years ago and is now and was at the time of Columbus a water gathering site. You have this beautiful crystal clear water, looks like you're hovering when you're in there. And in this cavern, we have everything from prehistoric sloth remains to extinct non-human primates to what's potentially a hearth, napped lithics, stone tools, ceramics, everything you could possibly dream of as an archaeologist is in this cavern. And we have several others like that. We're also working throughout the United States and the state of California and southern Lake Michigan and Indiana waters. We've got, Tori was working in Wisconsin all of last summer, and also in northern Lake Huron on the Michigan side. We have work going on in Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary. And the reason I'm mentioning these is because you're going to see a lot of examples through the rest of this talk that are from a variety of different things. And I don't want you to focus in on the story of one particular shipwreck, because what I'm going to talk about for the next 30 minutes or so is the technology behind it and how this technology can be synthesized and used in a variety of different ways. So when I'm jumping around from California to Dominican Republic and different slides, just keep in mind that we're talking about the technology here more so than the actual ships themselves. So these living museums in the sea are ultimately living laboratories. Since they were established, we can keep returning to them every single year in a relatively controlled environment and documenting change over time. We can come in 1988 when we first put down the cannons on the San Pedro and plot the fact that there are no corals whatsoever. There are no recruitments, there's some algal growth, that's it. You can come back 2 years later and now all of a sudden you're getting some golf ball corals, some fire coral in the muzzle, and we can go through and we can plot individual coral heads over time to monitor biological growth, as well as obviously if the artifacts themselves are deteriorating in any way. So 30 years of archaeological and biological monitoring. This is something that we don't, in the dive industry, and especially in underwater archaeology, we don't have a lot of comparative data. Divers in the 60s and 70s were not, for the most part, outside a select few scientists, were not taking pictures and measuring coral recruits on cannons. You can imagine, as I think most of you know, the dramatic changes that have happened in the last 30 years to the underwater environment, specifically coral reefs in the tropics and subtropics. So as coral reef health globally is declining, we don't really know what we had necessarily for the most part. We don't have thorough documentation from the 50s and 60s and 70s, or even from before that, when you read about the original diaries of Columbus and Las Casas and they talk about the sharks surrounding the ship as soon as you pull in. We don't have any real quantitative data on that. This is a little bit, this is a start. And now we can go in and, same thing with, archaeological resources. This is a lapstrake fishing boat in Emerald Bay and Lake Tahoe. And this is, what they would do. This is early 20th century westward expansion. This is finally the birth of recreation in the West, right? These are the first people coming out and actually vacationing on the West Coast and in Lake Tahoe. And they would go up to this boat camp and rent little motorboats. And in the winter, what they do with the boats? Well, they would sink them. They would fill them with rocks and sink them and then recover them in the spring because they'd be perfectly preserved underwater. Of course, they didn't always recover the boats, and so now we have some sunken boats throughout the bay that we can look at. But we can monitor the resources over time. We can go in now and we can look at these things and look at how they change, which brings me to structure from motion photogrammetry, which is this new technology, relatively new. Now it's getting to be pretty commonplace. But this is the idea that we can take 2D pictures of an object and using fancy Russian computer software, stitch them together to create a highly accurate 3D model. So in 2015, we got with the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary to return to the San Pedro and create a comprehensive site plan using photogrammetry. So, the first discussions were, well, it's typically used with a drone. I don't know how it would work underwater unless you had some kind of underwater drone. So couldn't a diver take the pictures? Well, yeah, a diver could take the pictures. So we sent a diver down with just GoPro cameras set to a 2-second time lapse, which, by the way, we were very embarrassed about. As divers, we have these tens of thousands of dollars in underwater housings and cameras. And for scientific research, the best thing is a $400 GoPro with the factory housing on it. And so we take these time-lapse photos and stitch them together, and ultimately the software creates these highly accurate 3D models. And this, for example, this is a top-down orthomosaic generated in the software of the San Pedro. We've never had a site plan like this. The initial site plans of the San Pedro from both treasure hunting and even the early archaeological excavations, the way that they were often made is, if you think about the amount of time it would take to plot all of this, well, we'll plot in the cannons, the major corals, maybe some ballasts along some transects. And then, you ask, like Professor Beaker, our director, well, how did the ballast stones, didn't they change year to year? Well, to be honest, we just went in and started drawing circles. When you look at these original site plans, a lot of the times they're just filled in circles because you only have the time and resources, especially when you're going, a couple miles offshore and you have to rent scuba tanks and pay for gas and you have limited funding. It's an expensive operation. And so you have to kind of prioritize. With this technology, we can go in and in 45 minutes, we can document an entire site extremely accurately. So this is a picture of the data collection itself. It's just swimming back and forth. We like to think of it as mowing the lawn. You're just going back and forth. You're making sure you have at least 60% front lap and 40% side lap on each photo. As you take them, they're basically overlapping with each other. And then once you load it into the software, it's going to go through and compare every single photo to every single other photo and find all the points that are similar and that are the same. And then it's going to use those to then run it again. And it's going to keep running through and finding all those similar points based on the previous times that you've generated these clouds of points, because ultimately that's what this is. It's just a bunch of similar points in 3D space that it is using, and it is tracking the depth as you're moving to be able to stitch it together and create a 3D model. So this is a dense cloud. So this is, you have all these tens of thousands of millions of points. And then the next step is, of course, it will tie all those points together and basically connect the dots to create this mesh that then it can drape a very accurate texture over. This is another one that the Enriquillo I was talking about, the Uss Dallian. When talking about the data collection methodology, this dive, we were not planning on doing photogrammetry. This was an exploratory dive to look at the site, to see if it was going to be feasible to do photogrammetry, if it was going to be too big. Our research coordinator, Matt Mouse, said, well, I'm going to bring the cameras just in case. And the conditions were good, the visibility was good, so he said, yeah, I'm going to take some pictures. So we took a couple thousand pictures, went home, and there we have a highly accurate 3D model of exactly what the Enriquillo looked like on June 11th in 2016. So then in the software, we can go in and we can take measurements. So this is that lap strike boat that we had. Now in 45 minutes, we can map the entire boat and then get back to the lab and say, oh man, what was the width of the stern at the, at the engine mount? And we can go back in and using the software, be able to pick those 2 points and figure out exactly, what that measurement is. Now, is it accurate? This is one thing that, with Professor Beaker, our director, we talked about a lot was, is it going to be accurate? We typically say, with underwater measurement, with currents and conditions, about a 3% margin of error is usually pretty acceptable when you're hand mapping something, especially over large distances. When you're looking at this and you're looking at the images, the first barge, that first big image I showed you, is almost 300 square meters. The estimated error on the entire model is about just over 1/10 of a centimeter. So we are talking about an extreme level of accuracy for the amount of field work that was done. And more accurate, in my opinion. I trust this more than I trust my own measurements in current and surge and thinking about all this task loading and things when you're underwater. So this allows us to go back in and take these measurements and do this. And one of the things that the software does is it can generate targets, which are these coded images that we can print on Mylar, a special underwater paper, take underwater with them and place them underwater. And then when we run the software, it can automatically detect those targets that it generated to help aid in it stitching together and decrease that margin of error because it knows the size and placement of the targets. So when we're looking at these things, we can go back then using that 30 years of monitoring data and using that archival data and see how these shipwrecks and how these resources have changed over time. So this is 2003, a site plan that was drawn. We can say we're going to look at the seat, the bench. You can see in 2005, it's fallen, it's in the stern. And then in 2016, it's moved forward. And this allows us to then give this data and this information to resource managers so that they can better make decisions about how to manage their sites. For example, this one, before even photogrammetry was around, using these pictures over time, we were able to recommend to the state parks, you need to put mooring buoys in around these because this is a very, very popular place. One of the most photographed spots in California is Emerald Bay. And there are people coming there all the time and camping and docking their boat and throwing anchor. And you were seeing anchor damage on a lot of these ships, or a lot of ships, these boats, these tiny little motorboats. And so they ended up installing mooring buoys, and now we've seen a drastic decline in the amount of anchor damage. This is the Muskegon, which is a steamship in the state of Indiana. We're all Indiana residents, right? How many people knew that we had, shipwrecks in the state of Indiana, real shipwrecks on the National Register of Historic Places? This is the SS Muskegon, which is an incredibly important shipwreck to Great Lakes commerce. It is so representative of everything from, the lumber trade and the upper Great Lakes to the Great Lakes passenger ferries. And it's less than a mile off the coast of Michigan City, Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore, well, now National Park. It's right there in the water. You could theoretically, the J.D. Marshall is another one that's now a state park. You could swim out to it. You could take a little boat, you could go dive it, and it's relatively intact. Except in somewhere around 1999, someone laid a massive 26-inch PVC pipe straight through the middle of the shipwreck. So the state of Indiana contacted us. We came and modeled it in 2016, the impact of the pipe. And then again in 2017, tracking change over time. The pipe's actually broken and scoured itself under the shipwreck and has caused an extreme amount of damage compared to the minimal damage when it was first laid in 1999. So now we can adequately provide recommendations. We can go in and say, yes, when you hire your commercial diving company to remove this pipe, you need to cut it exactly here, and this is the distances that you need to cut out. You need to cap it here. And it allows us to provide extremely detailed recommendations to the state and to ultimately the people who are managing the shipwreck. Another great case study of this technology, Hurricane Irma, right? So Hurricane Irma, we have good data from Hurricane Andrew, before and after Hurricane Andrew. 2004, actually one of the cannons on the San Pedro, which is right there, one of the cannons on the San Pedro disappeared after Hurricane Andrew. Was it stolen? Probably not. Was it swept away? Also probably not, because it's a cannon, or even a cement cannon, which is lighter than an iron cannon. So hypothesis was that it got buried in the sand, that there was a lot of sand movement after Andrew. We didn't really have a good idea. We didn't know, exactly what happened, but the cannon was gone and no one had seen it. 2015, we returned, it still wasn't there. But right in the middle, September, I think, on September 10th, 2017, Hurricane Irma makes landfall in the Florida Keys. But luckily, we have, from 2015, a highly accurate 3D map of the site. So over time, then we can go back after the hurricane and compare the two and overlay them on top of each other and see exactly how much, within 1/10 of a centimeter or so, how much these cannons and stones moved. So now all of a sudden we can look at the sand movement, and one thing you'll notice right off the bat is there's Cannon 5 has emerged from the depths. Cannon 5 has returned. We now have all of our cannons again. So we went in and lifted the cannon and put it back up on the rock so that hopefully with some ballast stones underneath it, it won't sink down into the sand again. But other things you'll notice, Cannons 3 and Cannon 6, if you can imagine the hurricane coming from the south, you can see it basically pushing these cannons. You can see it kind of rotate up. You can see Cannon 6 is now pushed up against Cannon 4. We have a very good idea of exactly how each stone and how each cannon and piece of this park moved over time when looking at these models. So again, yeah, you can see Cannon 3 and Cannon 6. You can see ballast stones. There are all of a sudden more ballast stones. So I think there was some significant sand movement uncovering. I mean, obviously Cannon 5 was uncovered, but you have tons and tons of ballast stones that have now been uncovered. As well as some hull remains. There are still some hull remains and some timbers on this ship. It's another ship nearby, the San Felipe. This is Professor Beaker and Tori here working. There was wood uncovered, previously undocumented wood at the bow of the ship. So we're able to go in, 3D model it, and now we have exact points of where this wood is, because in a couple of years it's probably going to be buried again. And so rather than trying to spend a lot of resources to map it in, or try and maybe remove pieces to preserve them, we can now, in the span of 45 minutes, be able to map this and have extremely accurate location data for the next time that it gets uncovered, and see how things have changed. And then this is the cave that I was talking about. Those of you that were here early, we can use this on land too, right? It's not just something that can be done underwater. So this is a good example of yes, on land or underwater, it's very easy to see how someone might not ever in their life be able to go experience a shipwreck or go dive on one of these shipwrecks, especially if you're not a diver. But something like this rock art site is a 4-mile hike into the jungle. It's a protected site that's not open to the public. It is then another almost kilometer back into a cave, crawling down steps and rappelling down big guano hills before you're ultimately greeted with what we like to describe as the Sistine Chapel of the Taino, the holiest of holy places. And here you have these, I think it's something like 2,000 individual pictographs depicting what we believe to be the life history of the Taino and the mythology of the Taino. And now we can go in and 3D map it. And now, the idea is, and this is something that's still in development, and I wish I had for you guys here to try on, is you can put on a virtual reality mask, stand right where he's standing with that camera, and look up at this massive wall and this massive cavern as if you were there. And it really, really, truly is breathtaking. It's hard to tell, how much your breath is being taken away by the fact that you're in a guano cave in 70-degree heat with the Dominican smoking in the corner, or because it's really that just incredible. But it is really something that's remarkable. And so now we can create this 3D model of it. And this doesn't look that impressive, except that a person is this tall, and if you were standing there looking up at this, this particular rock art panel, we and some of my colleagues believe to depict essentially contact with Europeans. So you have this, without getting too deep into it, the manufacturing of guayega bread from the tuberous plants, and then the hanging of the cacique anacaona on the tree, and ultimately the loading of the guayega bread on what I think looks like a Spanish caravel, with the hawse holes and the sails coming right at you. But that's just potential interpretation. There's also other pictographs in here, a bearded man, which of course the Taino didn't have beards. So it's really, really shocking to go in there and see this bearded face staring at you with a hat on. Which brings me to the next and kind of final stage of this, and part of this is, why are we doing this? Sure, yes, it's very easy to look at the scientific value of it and tracking change over time and giving it to resource managers. But ultimately, the whole purpose in my mind, and my whole motivation behind doing this, is public outreach and education, is the ability to take these models, and of course this is not one of the 3D photogrammetry models, this is an artist's rendition, but in the next 6 months or so, this will be our photogrammetric model, and be able to share it with the public. This is the Indiana Department of Natural Resources Shipwrecks website, which I highly recommend checking out. They've done a fantastic job for our only 200 square miles of Lake Michigan bottomland. We have a really, really good website that depicts the history and has historical photos and artists' rendition of 3D models, and we plan on updating these so that people can actually step in and step back in time and look at these shipwrecks in a more immersive 3D environment. We have websites like Sketchfab, which, while the quality is decimated greatly, you can go look at a shipwreck. You can go look at these lapstrake boats, and we can have annotations that you can go through and read about and see it from all different angles and be able to experience it in a way that you might not necessarily be able to do otherwise. Oops. Another thing with this is, again, you can see Tori in the front row didn't get the memo about taking her mask off for the photo, but what we can do is, our biggest secret is that this is really easy. The data collection. Obviously, the processing is a little bit different, but as far as the data collection goes, we don't want to say anyone can do it, but pretty much anyone can do it. Once you have the photos, that's all you really need. So we go and we've done training missions, or training exercises with a number of different agencies, and these are 4 California State Parks lifeguards, law enforcement, peace officers, who wanted us to come out and show them photogrammetry, because they do a lot of dive training for body recoveries and all the things that they do. And they said, well, why don't you teach us photogrammetry? While we're doing our training, we can take pictures. And so now we've built this stewardship with the California State Parks team, that they have invested themselves and their time into the cultural resources. And now it's become a big part of what they do, and they love it. They absolutely love the opportunity to go out on their boats and give back to the community. And as they say, well, it's your land to begin with, so we should share it with you. They've got a really great attitude about public lands and the state parks team. But so we went out and we trained them how to use it. And now they can collect this annual monitoring data while they're already doing the jobs that they're doing. The same thing with recreational divers. There's a project you can look up called Project Thistle, which is about a World War II shipwreck in the Red Sea that is essentially using recreational volunteer divers to collect 3D imaging of this massive shipwreck. And their goal is to map the entire thing inside and out for the public use and for the public to see. And anyone can go take pictures and send it to them. I mean, the more data, the better. This is citizen science, at its core. We can take these massive printouts, these extremely high resolution images, and we can bring them to Dominican government officials who can't even swim. And we can say, look, you're in charge of these lands. This is, these are your resources. Here's a much better picture of what exactly we're looking at. And we can show them exactly where all the endangered pillar coral are on the Guadalupe Underwater Archaeological Preserve for the entire 300 meters of reef zone. Same thing with the new park we just built. We can go say, yes, this is on the other side of the country, but this is your jurisdiction. This is what you manage. Here's what we did. Here's the product. It's what, here's what it is that you have people going to see and that you're now responsible for. And then we can go, to both, professional conferences and public outreach in museums. This is a world-class museum that is soon to open in Dominican Republic in the capital about shipwrecks. And they're using this technology with a very similar setup to this, although on a smaller scale, large touchscreens, so that visitors can come and without having to drive all the way across the country, rent scuba tanks, charter a boat, and go out there, they can see the shipwrecks throughout the country, and they can zoom in and they can look at the individual sites and they can explore the 3D models. Anyone that is interested, in December we did filming on this 3D photogrammetry on living museums in the sea with CNN's Great Big Story, which is a web documentary series. They do little 3-minute stories about various popular interest stories throughout the world, and we talked about living museums. Sometime in the next few months, we've already done the filming, National Geographic's Drain the Oceans, which is a television series where they basically say, okay, what if we took away all the water? What would it look like? Where they're using our 3D models and they're using their own computer-generated models to basically talk about Captain Kidd's shipwreck. And that one's gonna be all on the Cato Merchant, which I highly recommend tuning into. We're very excited for that. And then if you've ever been to the Children's Museum of Indianapolis, what it all kind of comes back to is how are we getting people excited about underwater cultural heritage, even in places where there isn't any or there isn't very much. So at the Children's Museum, we have a lot of these artifacts from Dominican Republic have been on loan to Indiana University, who have then taken them up to the Children's Museum, and we could conserve them here in our laboratory in the dungeon of the School of Public Health, or we could bring them up and do it in this front of this giant window where they see 1.2 million visitors a year and actually make it something that the people are engaged in and build some resource stewardship. And this is a combination. We've got the 3D model of the Verso on the right, because we can do it on a small scale. We can do it on a 300-meter reef zone. People are doing it with drones. We did one this summer of the entire La Isabella settlement, the settlement, Columbus's first permanent settlement in the New World, via drone photography. So this has been a really wonderful tool and opportunity for us. You can see they built a massive cannon pile, replicating Captain Kidd's cannon pile. Little kids can come in and they can put on their scuba tank and they can put on their goggles and they go hold their breath and practice measuring the cannons. And it's great. And it gets people interested and excited about, protecting these cultural resources. And one of the things, when we're talking about this interface with technology, it's absolutely amazing to be able to have a 6-year-old in front of you and go, have you ever seen a real pirate coin? All right, well, here you go. Can you hold it? Okay, put your hands out like this. Be very careful. How old do you think this is? Oh, 20? No, it's 300 years old. Now, do you want to visit that shipwreck? Here, put on this headset. Now let's see it for real. Let's look at it. And it's a wonderful feeling and a wonderful thing to be able to do and share with the public. And we've been really, really privileged that the Children's Museum has been so accommodating. But one of the next steps is we want something similar in Bloomington. We want to be able to have even a small window where people can come and people can talk and school trips can come. I just think it would be absolutely wonderful for that kind of outreach here at the university if we could share that with the Bloomington community. And ultimately what it all comes back to, and this is my last slide, is community and people. And shipwrecks are public interest. Shipwrecks are something that people get really excited about. Pirates and the high seas and treasure. But really it's taking these cultural resources and taking this cultural heritage that belongs to all of us and making it something that's accessible to everyone as well. So I hope that this kind of displayed some of it, and we have about 20 minutes or so for questions and to put on the VR goggles, and I'm going to pull up some models and while we're talking and show you the actual 3D models here on our massive screen. So yeah, thank you guys. So again, forgive the resolution on these is significantly decimated because it's on Sketchfab, this online sharing software. But this is the Benwood shipwreck, which actually collided. It was one of the first US casualties of the Second World War, ship casualties in US waters. excluding Pearl Harbor, obviously. But they were running blackout conditions to hide from German U-boats, and it collided with another ship, the Tuttle, an American ship. So it's officially a war casualty, but you can actually see at the bow where it collided with the Tuttle. And then ultimately, it was used for bombing practice afterwards, because it was just sitting there, sticking out of the water. So it was basically stripped to the waterline from bombing and target practice. So this is the Benwood. You can see, one of the limitations with this technology is if conditions aren't, if conditions aren't consistent, you're going to end up with some, not errors, but unique things about your model and about the thing that you're modeling. For example, this, about halfway through our modeling, we worked from bow to stern, got to about here, switched tanks, got back in the water. As we start going, the Boy Scouts of America show up and moor their boat right over the shipwreck, which, it's use. That's what the mooring buoys are there for, and the current was blowing this way, so it blew the boat right over, so we have this nice big shadow of the Boy Scouts of America boat in the middle of it, which is fine, but it's a nice little case study. And then the other big limitation that we have right now is light. This is all in shadow, right? So it has, the tech software has trouble as is with vertical complexity. Like if you were to try and model a tree, that complexity is it's gonna have a very hard time picking out points and depth of field. So one of the things we get is with a lot of the branching corals or a lot of the thick parts that stick straight up on a shipwreck, it doesn't necessarily render completely. But then the things in shadow, it can't pick out at all if it can't see it. If it can't pick any points out that are the same, it's not gonna be able to stitch them together. So we do have, we do. The biggest problem though, is if they're not diffuse, the shadows change. And so if the shadows change, then it's gonna be different. Yeah, it's not gonna line up. So we've talked about it. We've talked about, floodlights. We've talked about maybe doing it at night, but you'd have to line up a whole lot of flashlights or figure out, some kind of diffuser with the amount of lumens that would be necessary to light that up. It's a lot to ask right now with what we have that's affordable. We've talked about buying some waterproof, Pelican floodlights, but they're, thousands and thousands of dollars, and I think it'll get cheaper in time. I think we'll get there, but right now, not so much. So here's the Enriquillo, which you can see in the headset. And so here's the Enriquillo, USS Dallian. I think on Sketchfab you can't see it. You can't on Sketchfab, but on the actual model, there's a stingray that stood very, very still for 45 minutes that shows up sitting in the sand down there, which is just too cool. One thing you'll notice as you start looking at these models is there's almost no biological life, because anything that moves, it just ignores. So all of the fish, even the sea fans is enough movement that they will not render, which is great from an archaeological perspective because it's as if we just scraped off all that bioclutter. But that is one thing that it just will not pick up, is any kind of movement. And then another thing that's been really, really great for biologists is volumetric calculations. So here's a better example. Prior to this, there was no real reliable way to calculate the volume of a coral. The best that we had as an industry and as a field was to take a 2D picture and do surface area and have a ruler for scale that was on the same plane kind of and just calculate surface area, which isn't that great because corals grow in all kinds of different directions depending on the species. But now we can go in and actually select just the coral head itself that we want and actually do a volumetric calculation of how much that coral has grown, to the cubic centimeter from years to years. So that's been really, really great tool when talking about coral growth and talking about how we're monitoring the corals in relation to the shipwrecks, because that's something that we just, there was really no way to do it. Which also brings me to damage assessment. the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, the original reason that they reached out to us about this technology was, you've got a freighter that runs aground on a reef and it's going to a court case. How much does the state of Florida ask for in damages to that reef? How do you calculate how much volume of the reef was destroyed? And what they did before is they just ran a transect, and they would go along the transect and they would take every coral that was broken off and they'd collect it and they'd put it in a 1-by-1 grid. And then they'd say, yes, there were 3 square meters of coral damage. Well, now we can go in, if we have the reefs mapped, and we can calculate exactly what that volumetric loss is of coral year to year, and immediately following and preceding grounding site of the big ship. Here is a transplanted coral on the Guadalupe Underwater Archaeological Preserve, which was a coral that had fallen off down the reef, was in danger, was in the sand, was going to die. So we said, well, why don't we just pick it up and cement it? Just see how it works. Cement it. Just take some Portland #2 cement underwater in little baggies, mix it on the boat, glob it onto the top of the cannon, because ultimately cement is limestone, right? Which is just coral substrate. So put it on there, drove some nails into the cement and just plopped the coral on top, and it has grown over 200% since we initially transplanted it. It's now slowed down growing because it ran out of cement to grow on. So we can now go through year by year and track exactly what the volume of this coral, this Meandrina meandrites, is from year to year, as well as any other corals that might be growing around it and diseased. You can see, again, the shadows didn't quite render underneath, but it's an acceptable loss. So do you guys have any questions? People online, if there's anyone, do you have any questions? Mm-hmm. That's a good question. I believe, Tori, if you know off the top of your head, I think it was about 2,000. Yeah, it was lower than usual for a ship of that size. We usually take way more photos than we need. So a lot of times the smaller things end up looking better because we didn't just overload it with 10,000 photos. Yeah, it's 710 images. So this was 710 images for a relatively large shipwreck. The Benwood, which is a little bit bigger, probably about twice the size, was about 10,000 images. The largest that we've done was the entire, not just the Guadalupe Underwater Archaeological Preserve, but the entire reef zone. Is it in this collection, Tori? Probably not, no. Which is the entire reef zone, which is 300 meters. And it was massive undertaking, but I think it only ended up being about 15,000 images. France? Yeah, so this is a good representation. Again, the quality is decimated because it's in Sketchfab, but as she was saying, for those of you not listening on the mic or listening on the microphone, this shipwreck is extremely deep. It's about 130 feet, so near the absolute limit for recreational diving. And so how do you map something like that when it's going to take hours and hours and hours? Well, swim transects over it from a shallower depth, and now all of a sudden you can create a model, and as she described it, was like someone just took a box of matches and threw it in a pile. And how do you map that? Well, this is the technology, this is the solution. And this is in Wisconsin, in Lake Michigan. And you can see, again, our coded targets, right? These basically 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper with these little target symbols on it that we place underwater. We glue them to cutting boards and then bolt some lead weight on the back of it and just set them down so they don't move. And it's, it's like magic. It's really incredible technology. Mm-hmm.
Are there Taino? I mean, I was reading online, like they don't exist as a tribe per se anymore, but obviously there are peoples who have that ancestry. Is there like an advisory board?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Tassie basically asked if there was a descendant community for the Taino, because they were widely considered to be wiped out, if there was any kind of advisory board or committee, and there really isn't right now. There's been a huge resurgence in Neo-Taino and people identifying as Taino, which is fantastic and we love to see, but there aren't really communities in the Dominican Republic that we can reach out to. We've tried, we've done a little bit. We have local involvement. The Museum of the Dominican Man has been a really close friend and colleague of ours. Obviously the DGPCS, the Underwater Cultural Patrimony Office, has been huge into the Taino research from our side of things. But unfortunately, we can't go to the Taino Tribal Council and ask for advice and recommendations and bring them in on it and do training. We went with the best we can do is involve Dominicans, because they're the people that are identifying as Neo-Taino, and to get the Dominicans involved in the conversation and to let them lead the research and be the ones driving these research questions is the best answer that we have at the moment for this. I have some of the my favorite things have been going to people. There's a guy, Tony, on the North Coast who identifies as Neo-Taino that we met this last summer, and being able to show him these products and these things that are several hundred miles away is just incredible. I would never go down there, but now this is a part of his culture and is a part of identity that we can now bring to him, and that is available through this digital technology. Mm-hmm. Yes, so yeah, 3D scanning is another thing that we have worked with, that especially in cave environments is vastly superior, because you don't have the real whole lighting issue. In 3D scanning, one of the things we don't quite get as good of a texture, although you can combine the two, and there are people who are laying photogrammetric textures over 3D scans, which is just awesome and incredible. But the main reason that we're not is that our research, for the most part, is very qualitative. It's very much used for outreach and education, and this is so easy and fast and cost effective that this is what we've been doing. But 3D scanning, for the most part, is going to be superior. And Tori, I don't know if you've worked with 3D scanning in Wisconsin at all, much more than I have.
Oh, not as much. It was mainly using remotely operated vehicles.
Yeah. Yeah, easy to bring with you underwater, portable. The other bit of, we do a lot of remote sensing, so magnetometry, side scan sonar, stuff like that, mostly for locating anomalies. And then once we get under, we can either do our work or use 3D photogrammetry, structure from motion photogrammetry for the mapping, because it's so quick and efficient and cheap. GoPro cameras, $400 or however much they cost. Any other questions? It depends how nice of a model you want, and what computer you're using. Our measly laptop, or pretty nice laptop with 32 gigabytes of RAM, we can run a low quality model overnight of a lot of these shipwrecks and at least get something to see if it's going to align. So we have one field laptop that we use in Dominican Republic and in more remote areas where we can go out, collect the data during the day, come back at night. We have to wait overnight, be 6 to 12 hours or so, to see if we even got something half the time. And then once we have it, we say, oh, okay, great. This is going to work. We don't have to go out and collect more data. Or we got 50% alignment, conditions weren't good, visibility was pretty bad, we're not going to have a model, we're going to have to go back to that site again and dive it. When we first started doing this, it was totally blind. We'd fly to Florida, we would spend a week there collecting data and taking images. We'd have no access to a laptop with any kind of capabilities of running this. And we'd have to get back and hope that the $10,000 we just spent in the field was worth it. Usually it was, because again, it's black magic. I always finish it and I'm like, this is never going to work. I just took a bunch of pictures. There's no way that they're going to align. There's no way. And then you get back and it aligns perfectly. Or we send the images to Tassie and she's like, oh, here's your model. And we're like, we weren't even trying to do photogrammetry on that. We have done, even videos. People have been like, hey, I took this video of this shipwreck like 10 years ago. Do you think that we can, get a model from it? I'm like, well, it depends. What's the frame rate and what was the resolution? If it's good enough, then we can pull frames. And if there's enough overlap, we can make it work. We have. Granted, it's not common that you get a video from 10 years ago that's going to be 4K, 60 FPS, and that's going to come out, smooth enough. But it does happen.
Yeah, so I was absolutely thinking, even if I don't get to sort of come on a trip
Mm-hmm.
anywhere where we have internet, right? Like I can run models
Mm-hmm.
on the fly. And in Florida, we might even like just outside, like it's possible I can boat,
Mm-hmm.
you know, but we've been able to wired.
Yeah.
But you know, we could run them like basically
Mm-hmm. Yes.
and get like particle clouds out of, you know, so we could run a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, so supercomputing, the better better the computer, the faster and easier it's going to be to get the models. And so that's one thing that is a actual barrier in this technology as far as the accessibility goes. Is you need the computer and you need the expensive software to be able to run it, to be able to make the models. On the flip side of that, anyone with a camera can get the pictures. And we always talk about, in 10 years, there's going to be a much better program than Agisoft or Metashape or whatever there is right now. There's going to be a better program, and those pictures are still going to be the same, and you can put them in there, and it's going to create a better model than you were able to. The pictures is the data. The picture is the important thing. We can always upload the pictures into the program, but without the pictures, there's no data. The last thing I will say is, our program is very, very student-driven. If anyone listening or anyone knows students that want to get involved, we have everything from a never been diving in my entire life, never even been snorkeling, all the way up to the professional level. So anyone with any kind of dive experience, faculty and staff members, use your FEAR mission. You can come in, take a class, get scuba certified. We'll do our local training. And then, of course, we have these research projects. And it's very, very student driven. So if you know any students that want to get involved in this or interested in this, just reach out. You can contact TASI or the US people, or just look me up on IU directory, or search underwaterscience.indiana.edu, and all our contact information is there, and we can give you course planning and all that. So yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for having us.
How many